Today, I wanted to provide a high-level overview of product deployment best practices, or how to best migrate changes from one environment to the next, including a couple of tools that can be utilized as well as some documentation standards to undertake. Migrations are best suited when your data model has already been established within the target environment through a database copy. Additions and changes to configurations, as opposed to establishing the solution, should be the focus of a migration. Regardless of the size of the changes needed, taking the extra time to gather all the loose ends, document, and bring in your adjustments in the correct order is all worth avoiding potential rework that can arise from attempting to drop an entire model in on one migration job, or assuming that you can override a change through the migration itself. Not all objects are migratable, however. Objects such as server properties, log level settings, publication manager objects, and configuration repositories such as DAM, scheduled exports, imports, and promotions. Scheduled activities can be moved in parallel with the migration by exporting the jobs much as you would a record and importing into the target environment when all other necessary components have been set in place. Some objects are migratable, though cannot be selected directly within the UI, but they do get moved when other objects are selected. These include components such as category attributes and validation rules, which are included when the assigned profiles are migrated, and link relationships and user preferences, which are included when the assigned repository is migrated. The first step and the first tool provided to you would be pulling the compare extract files from the server itself. Because these migrations do not account for deleting components or making changes if the name or the type of an attribute, code set, or any other component that doesn't exactly match the change coming in, it's imperative to run the provided compare scripts on both environments to capture any and all changes flagged for migration, as well as any manual adjustments that need to be made in the target environment prior to the migration. The included scripts to be run would be code sets, core, which includes the most common objects, including groups, profiles, validation rules, and repositories, import export, which captures templates, search preferences, which captures user preferences and advanced searches, security, and then services framework. All these scripts would be run at a query size of 512. There are 4 additional larger scripts to be run that will compare tables and EPX components, such as SQL, SQL Services Framework, EPX SQL, and EPX Services Framework. These scripts require a larger query size of 8192. Running the compare scripts is a matter of navigating to the SQL Server Manager within the database server. Once we've made our way into the database server itself, we'll want to open up SQL Server Management Studio. And because these scripts are actually part of the installations, you can go to Open File. And as part of the latest deployment file, you'll have a set of SQL scripts and MSS SQL scripts. What we're going to do for the purposes of this example today is just run the code set script. I've previously run one, and then I made a few changes, and we're going to run them against this code set script itself. So once we open, we can execute to see what a sample would look like once it's finished running. This particular environment has quite a few code sets built into it, so this execution will take just a little bit of time. But once we've run that, what we can do is make sure that our query size is correct. So as you recall, the text size needs to be 512 for this particular script. Once we've toggled that, we'll want to actually make sure that we send it out to a file itself. So this generates an RPT file that we can utilize within WinMerge, which will be our next tool to compare directly between the two environments to see what changes we may need to make and what can be migrated or overwritten. So once we've toggled that and we execute the statement, what we'll want to do is actually give it a naming convention. So this is one that I'll want to overwrite to compare for. Yes, we'll replace it. The SQL query itself will start to run. Now that we've verified that our query has run successfully, we'll want to move that report file onto our local machine, which we can go grab here. Once we have our files on our local machine, then we'll jump into the WinMerge function. Back on our local machine, and once we've collected all of our compare extracts from both environments, we need to run them through an application such as WinMerge, which can quickly detect and display any discrepancies that will need to be accounted for. So within WinMerge itself, you can go to Open File, and it allows you to compare 1 to 3. Typically, we're only going to need to utilize these first 2. For me, as a rule, I tend to put the source environment first and the target environment second, so I can read it as a flow from left to right. So what we'll want to do first is go grab our original file, which I have stored here in compare. So we'll call this compare1. And we want to compare it against the target. Once WinMerge has finished compiling the two compare scripts that we provided to it, we're left with a view of, on the left-hand column, the source environment, and on the right-hand column, the target environment. This gives us a direct side-by-side view of what's in each environment and what potential changes need to be captured. You have your location pane, which is used as a legend here on the left-hand side. Typically, we're going to be looking for a lot of white space, which means there's very few changes that need to be made. If we want to toggle quickly, as opposed to scrolling through such a large file, you can utilize the jump to next difference button here, and we can go through and catalog what we see as our changes. One big one that we made here was we have, say, product types on our target environment, but that is no longer in the source. Because the migrations can't handle the deletion, we will have to mark this on our documentation of what to actually be removed. As we continue to scroll through the file itself, we can take a look at what else has been changed. So we can see another one here where this is not in the source, but again is in the target. But this one seems to be in both, but there is going to be some variation. So you can double click onto the actual line difference itself and scroll, and WinMerge will actually highlight what the specific difference is for you. So in this case, it is an uppercase U in the source, but lowercase in the target. This would represent a good change that would need to be made directly in the environment itself. Because there may well be a very large amount of adjustments that need to be made, particularly as part of a UAT phase, we would need somewhere to catalog our changes that would be collaborative, as well as the focus of any change meetings needed to approve or reject proposed changes. For this, we've created a document that would capture the full process and allow you to flag all the necessary information needed when bringing in your migration. This brings us to another tool that we've actually developed for this specific instance. We use it as a migration template to track any particular migration that goes from one environment to the next, and we typically use it as the central keystone for meetings to capture these changes. What we've done is we've created a pre-migration tab that runs through a list of different references and suggestions, as well as the names and roles of any parties that are involved. Your Migrate Out tab will allow you to toggle the user that is requesting a specific component type, and then they can name the specific component itself. Any manual changes that need to be done would be in this Changes tab here, where we define the component that needs to be changed, if there's a specific attribute, such as if it's a repository, if we are going to edit the component, just delete it, what the renaming of the edit would be, or if there's any notes that need to be captured here as well. Migrate In will help us define the components that are on the Migrate Out function itself by using the same exact list by the name, and then we can mark if it's a full or a partial migration. If it's a brand new component or function that we're bringing over, we would want to bring in full, or if we're just updating attributes, rules, or if we're just bringing in anything new, we could just make it as a partial without overwriting an entire profile or an entire repository itself. You could define that specific attribute if it's a partial here, and then you can define again if it's just a straight migrate being brand new, or an overwrite being if it's a product type and we want to change it from a varchar to an integer. You also have your scheduled activities, though they would be moved in as records. You could just name the job type and then the job itself, and then you can extract the records and bring them back in. And we have additional tabs for any EPX components that need to be moved, any properties that need to be moved, any scripts that might need to be moved, and then any additional notes for the actual migration itself. I went ahead and filled out one of these templates with a series of examples to show the way that it would be best used. So in the pre-migration tab, I've defined myself as the data model role. In Migrate Out, I've flagged 4 different components, being the material profile, material staging repository, a vendor material attribute view, and a vendor material export template. For the changes, I've captured what we found in our WinMerge comparison report, being that I want to remove the product types code set entirely. And then in ticket category, I want to edit and update the name new user request with a capitalized user. I renamed the attribute here and I put in my note exactly what I want to be done. In Migrate In, then I further define the specific components, the names, and if it's full or partial. So you see 3 rows for profiles here because I've defined this as a partial migration. I've defined the specific attributes, and I just want these migrated, meaning that these are 3 brand new attributes that I want to update this profile with in the target environment. I also want to fully update the repository itself with an overwrite, with the assumption that I have attribute properties or say rule properties that I need changed and updated for the target. I also want to fully migrate my new attribute security filter, as well as the export template for the vendor material records. You'll see this additional column here labeled migration order. The reason we've defined this is WinShuttle actually has a deployment best practices document that is out there that defines a specific cadence for imports. Really what this does is this helps create the building blocks for any potential changes or migrations that need to come in. So because repositories are built on profiles, and because filters and templates require the repositories to be built correctly, you would want to bring things in on this particular order. If we had had code sets in here that we needed to migrate, those would go first and bump profiles down to second, because the profiles could be built within those brand new code sets that we need to bring in. Once we've reviewed this document and verified all changes with any parties involved, we would need to run through the change approval process and make any necessary manual adjustments within the target environment. From there, we can start to generate our migrate out file and move it over to our target. Following the deployment best practices guide, we would want to filter down to migration, which is currently only available within the admin UI, and toggle migrate out. We need to define a specific zip file name as well as the specification file name, and it's best to keep them both under the same cadence so that they're easiest to find. And at the onset of the project, you'll want to define a very specific naming convention so that it's easy accountability for any migration that's gone through. And if there is any errors, you can jump back to a previous model and bring in any adjustments. Once we've defined our naming convention, we can select next. From here, we can choose any specific components that we need to be brought in. So we can toggle any migrate out. We can select all of them or uncheck all of them. For the purposes of these type of migrations, though, we would typically not choose all migrations. So we would want to select just a couple of specific options themselves. In order to move the migration files that we've just generated, we need to jump back into the server from our target. First, going to our file server, we would need to go down to our EnterWorks folder. Underneath EnterWorks, shared, and migration. We can pick up the files that we had, copy them to our machine, or directly to the additional server itself. Once you've copied them from the source to the target environment and they are staged within the same folder, EnterWorks shared migration, we can then go into the target environment and select what components we want to migrate back into the system. Back in the admin UI, we'll then select migrate in. As long as those files that we generated are within that specific shared migration folder, we can select them from the drop-down here, and then we can choose our specific components. Based on what we decided as far as full, partial, or overwrite, we can then select the options that we want. If we need to bring this entire profile in as a brand new profile, we leave as migrate in full, and we drop down and just hit migrate. However, if we want to do a partial migration, we select the partial checkbox and then select manage. From here, you can pick specific components that you actually want to be able to bring in. So with the assumption that, say, the account GUID, I'm changing the data size from 5 to 10, but all of these state tabs are going to be brand new, so I just want to bring them in specifically. So if I have just these few components that I want to bring in and just this one being overwritten, I can define that within this changes tab. I don't want to bring in any new rules, so then I can select save, and it saves my changes to my partial migration. From here, you would just select migrate, bring back in all the information from the migration job. One extra step that can be undertaken is running through the compare extract setup once again to verify that all your changes are actually in place. The process of going through multiple iterations of compare files, keeping a running list on the migration documentation, as well as making all the manual changes can appear tedious at first, though it will save a lot of time in the long run, and it helps ensure a smooth migration almost every single time because all corners of the migration and all components included in the migration can be accounted for and fully documented. For further information and reading, you can consult the WinShuttle Deployment Best Practices Guide found directly through their portal itself, as well as a few other brown bag sessions that they have provided. Thank you for your time.